The report landed on Brigadier General Howard Kellerman's desk at 06:30 on a Tuesday morning in October 1944, and he read it 3 times before calling his operations officer into the room. The report had been filed by Lieutenant Colonel Frank Waverly, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 117th Infantry Regiment. Waverly was not a man who admitted difficulty easily. He had fought in North Africa, had crossed the beaches at Utah, had pushed his battalion through the bocage with the kind of relentless forward pressure that had earned him a Silver Star and a reputation for getting things done. He was not the kind of officer who asked for help, which made what he had written in the final paragraph of his after-action report all the more striking. Recommend higher command, consider assigning Canadian forces currently operating in Sector 9 to lead future reduction operations against fortified canal positions in this area. Their methods for close assault of prepared urban defenses are more developed than our own. We have attempted this 3 times. The results have not justified the cost. Kellerman set the report down and looked at his operations officer, Major Dennis Crane. "Get me everything we have on what the Canadians are doing in Sector 9, he said, and get me Waverly on the phone. The situation in the Netherlands in the autumn of 1944 was not what anyone had planned for. The breakout from Normandy in August had produced a momentum that seemed, for several weeks, like it might carry Allied forces all the way to Berlin before the year was out. Paris had fallen. German forces had streamed eastward in disorder. The operational maps had looked almost too good to be real. They were. As Allied forces approached the German border and encountered prepared defensive positions, the advance collapsed from a rapid exploitation into a grinding attritional struggle against an enemy that had learned over 5 years of war how to make the most of terrain that favored defense. The Netherlands was among the most favorable terrain on Earth for a defender who knew what he was doing. Canals, rivers, dikes, flooded polders. The entire country was a series of natural obstacles that channeled any attacking force into predictable corridors. German engineers had made a bad situation worse, destroying bridges, reinforcing strong points, and converting every village along the major routes into a fortified position that had to be cleared before the advance could continue. American forces had excellent doctrine for mobile warfare. They had proven it in France, where speed and firepower had combined to produce the kind of results that made history. They had less developed doctrine for what the Netherlands demanded: the methodical, often house-by-house reduction of prepared defensive positions in built-up areas against defenders who had had weeks to prepare and who were not going to be swept aside by artillery and a subsequent armor thrust. Waverly had learned this at considerable cost. His battalion had been assigned to clear 3 fortified villages along a canal line in late September. Each village was held by a German force of roughly company strength, not a large number, with prepared positions, integrated anti-tank coverage, and pre-registered artillery support. On paper, this should have been achievable. The first attempt lasted 4 hours and produced nothing except casualties. The standard approach, artillery preparation followed by an armor-led advance with infantry in support, had destroyed most of the buildings in the target village without eliminating the defenders. The rubble that resulted was, if anything, better defensive terrain than the buildings had been. German anti-tank guns firing from concealed positions in the debris stopped the armor before it reached the village perimeter. Without armor, the infantry advance stalled under machine gun fire. Waverly pulled his companies back with over 80 casualties and none of his objectives. He adjusted the approach for the second attempt. Shorter artillery preparation, less warning to the defenders, armor and infantry moving simultaneously from the start. The attack penetrated the village this time. What followed was 3 days of fighting that consumed more than 200 additional casualties before the position was finally cleared. The Germans defending the village had numbered fewer than 120 men. Waverly sat with his battalion staff that evening and worked through what the numbers were telling him. He had spent more than 300 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, to clear a position held by a force roughly 1/4 his own size. He was holding a village that was substantially rubble. 2 more villages remained on his assignment list. The mathematics were not sustainable. The coordination meeting with Canadian forces the following week changed how Waverly understood the problem. The Canadians were operating in the adjacent sector, assigned to the same general category of mission, clearing fortified German positions in Dutch villages along the canal network. Waverly had requested the meeting to compare notes. What he heard made him sit back in his chair. Canadian casualty rates for similar operations were running at roughly 1/3 of what his battalion had experienced. Their success rate, objectives cleared, time required, was substantially better. They were doing the same work against the same kind of defenses in the same terrain, and they were doing it differently enough that the results were not comparable. The Canadian officer across from him was Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Forsyth, commanding a battalion of the Queen's Own Rifles. Forsyth had fought in Sicily, at Ortona, through the Italian Winter Campaign, and into France. He had been doing some version of this specific kind of fighting for 2 years. "Walk me through how you approach one of these villages," Waverly said. Forsyth was direct. "We start by accepting a premise your doctrine doesn't accept, that the defenders will still be operational when our infantry arrives, regardless of how much artillery preparation we put in first. In a fortified position, artillery kills some people and disrupts some things, but it doesn't clear the position. It moves rubble around and gives the defenders better cover. So we stop building the plan around the assumption that fire support will solve the problem before we get there." He continued, "Our armor works at close range, not 200 meters from a building, 20 meters, sometimes less. The tank puts a main gun round through the wall of a specific building while the infantry is already moving toward the breach. The infantry doesn't wait for the position to go quiet. They move while the defenders are still dealing with the tank round. Speed is the main weapon. German doctrine assumes attackers will pause after taking fire. We don't pause." Waverly asked about Canadian casualties. "They're not low," Forsyth said honestly. "Urban combat kills people, and there's no approach that changes that fundamental reality. But we lose fewer people using these methods than we would using methods that don't fit what we're actually doing, and we accomplish objectives faster, which matters because every additional hour of exposure means more German artillery and more counterattack risk." Waverly asked how long Canadian forces had been working this way. "Since Ortona," Forsyth said. "December 1943. That was where we learned most of it. What works, what doesn't, what kills your own people, and what kills the defenders. 2 years of this specific kind of fighting. Your forces haven't had that accumulation. Waverly observed a Canadian assault 2 days later. He watched from an observation post as Forsyth's battalion went into a fortified village that intelligence assessed as comparable in strength to the positions his own battalion had been attacking. The artillery preparation lasted less than 30 minutes and was targeted at specific known positions rather than applied across the entire objective. Then it stopped, and the Canadians moved. What Waverly observed for the next 4 hours was a form of warfare his own training had not prepared him to execute. Canadian tanks moved in tight columns along routes that prior reconnaissance had identified, armor and infantry in immediate physical proximity to each other. When the assault force reached the first buildings, the tanks pulled directly to the walls, close enough that the main gun depression was aimed at specific windows and doorways, and fired. The effects were immediate and severe. Entire wall sections came down. Buildings caught fire. The shock of the close-range direct fire was not the same thing as artillery falling nearby, and the defenders responded to it differently. There was less time to absorb the impact, less time to reposition, less opportunity for the organized defensive response that German training prepared soldiers to execute. Canadian infantry moved through the breaches before the dust had settled. Room clearing was fast and violent. When German defenders tried to move between positions, the standard response when an assault penetrates one building and threatens to isolate another. They moved through spaces that Canadian fire was already covering. The speed of the assault closed every potential escape route before German forces could use it. 4 hours from the initial assault to the village secured, approximately 35 Canadian casualties. Of the 110 German defenders, roughly 70 were killed and the rest captured. Waverly watched it from his observation post and tried to find flaws in what he was seeing. The close-range tank work was dangerous for the armor. Canadian tank crews accepted exposure that American doctrine would have classified as unnecessary risk. The infantry advance into partially cleared positions was aggressive to a degree that exceeded what American training prescribed. But the results were not arguable. After the operation, he told Forsyth as much. "Your methods work. They're also more aggressive than anything our rules of engagement would permit, and our training doesn't prepare us for them." Forsyth nodded. "I understand the constraints your forces operate under. What I can tell you is that in urban terrain against fortified positions, aggression and speed save more lives than caution and distance. The close tank work is dangerous for us. It's more dangerous for the people on the other side of the wall." Waverly's after-action report, filed that evening, ran to 11 pages. The final paragraph was the one that landed on Kellerman's desk 2 days later. His recommendation was not made carelessly. He had served long enough to know what it would look like. An American officer telling his chain of command that a Canadian unit should be given missions his own battalion had failed to accomplish. He had written the paragraph 4 times before settling on language that said plainly what the operational situation required. Recommend higher command, consider assigning Canadian forces currently operating in Sector 9 to lead future reduction operations against fortified canal positions in this area. Their methods for close assault of prepared urban defenses are more developed than our own. We have attempted this 3 times. The results have not justified the cost. Kellerman read it, called Waverly, listened to his account of the coordination meeting and the observed Canadian assault, and then spent an hour with his operations staff working through the implications. The recommendation was forwarded up the chain. What followed was not formalized as policy. Coalition politics made explicit acknowledgement of the situation difficult, but the operational pattern shifted in ways that were visible to anyone paying attention. Canadian formations increasingly received the lead roles for fortified village reduction in the Netherlands campaign. American forces increasingly focused on operations in more open terrain where their mobility and firepower could be applied to full effect. The Scheldt Estuary campaign that autumn demonstrated the results. Canadian forces cleared the fortified positions that controlled access to the port of Antwerp, operations that were brutal and costly, but that produced the objectives with a consistency and efficiency that reflected the specialized expertise 2 years of Italian and French urban combat had built. The port opening was essential to the Allied logistics situation for the remainder of the campaign, and the Canadian forces who cleared the approaches to it paid for every kilometer in blood. The American forces who would have been assigned those missions instead contributed to operations in terrain that matched their strengths, including the mobile defensive fighting during the Ardennes Offensive in December 1944, where American flexibility and rapid response proved exactly what was needed. The combination worked better than either force working against its own limitations would have. Waverly commanded his battalion through the remainder of the war. He was promoted. When he wrote about the Netherlands in his memoirs, he was direct about what the experience had taught him. Being an effective commander sometimes means recognizing that another force has capabilities your own force lacks, and saying so clearly. The Canadians had spent 2 years learning how to clear fortified urban positions. My battalion had not had that experience. Sending my men repeatedly into a situation they were not prepared for would have cost lives without producing better results than the Canadians could achieve. The honest assessment was the right one, regardless of how it reflected on us. The principle behind that assessment was one that the Allied coalition had to learn repeatedly and from multiple directions across the course of the war. Every force had strengths that were real and limitations that were also real. Effective coalition warfare meant understanding the difference, assigning missions to the forces whose capabilities matched what the mission required, and resisting the pressure to pretend that national pride was the same thing as operational readiness. Forsyth's battalion had not developed its urban assault expertise through any special gift or inherent advantage. They had developed it the hard way, through Ortona and Casino and a dozen smaller engagements, where the cost of getting it wrong was measured in the faces of men who did not come back. That accumulated expertise was real, was specific, and was worth using where it would do the most good. Waverly's willingness to say so plainly in an after-action report that he knew would be read by people who might not be pleased to read it was the kind of professional honesty that coalition warfare depends on, and that military cultures built on national pride find genuinely difficult to produce. The Dutch villages along the canal lines were cleared, the port of Antwerp opened, the Allied advance resumed. The cost was high. The alternative would have been higher.